For 45 years, Iran's oil infrastructure survived every sanction, every embargo, every diplomatic isolation the West could design. That ended 19 days ago. Let that sink in. On April 13th, 2026, the United States Navy deployed what defense analysts are calling the most comprehensive maritime interdiction operation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the results are not theoretical. They are measurable, they are accelerating, and they are historically unprecedented. According to Kepler, the maritime intelligence firm that tracks 90% of global oil movements, Iran's crude exports have collapsed from 2.1 million barrels per day to just 567,000 in under 3 weeks. That is a 73% evaporation of Iran's primary revenue source in the time it takes most companies to process a quarterly earnings report. The White House, speaking to CNBC on background, estimates Iran is now losing approximately $500 million per day. Not per week, per day. But here is what almost every headline is missing, and it changes the entire strategic picture. This is not just about oil that cannot leave Iranian ports. This is about an infrastructure approaching a technical collapse point that could take decades to reverse. Let us walk through exactly what the United States just did, how Iran's oil empire is responding, and why the consequences of the next 30 days will reshape Middle Eastern energy architecture for the next 30 years. Start with the operation itself, because the scale is genuinely without modern precedent. Operation Sentinel Guardian, the operational name that has now been confirmed by the Department of Defense in statements to Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, is not a sanctions regime. Sanctions are legal documents. This is a physical presence operation involving what U.S. Naval Institute News reports as no fewer than 12 surface combatants, 3 nuclear attack submarines, constant P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft coverage, and rotating deployments from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit specifically trained for visit, board, search, and seizure operations, VBSS in military terminology. Think about the operational geometry here. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, is just 21 miles wide. That is the distance of a half marathon. On the northern side sits Iran. On the southern side sits Oman and the United Arab Emirates. And according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through that narrow channel every single day under normal conditions, representing roughly 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. Iran has always understood this geography as leverage. For decades, Tehran's ultimate trump card was straightforward. If we close Hormuz, the world's economy chokes within 72 hours. On March 4th, 2026, following escalating tensions that began in late February, Iran made good on that threat. Naval mines were deployed. Revolutionary Guard fast attack craft swarmed commercial vessels. By March 8th, insurance premiums for Gulf transits had increased by 400%, according to Lloyd's of London underwriting data. The flow of oil did not stop completely, but it narrowed to a trickle, and global markets responded immediately. Brent crude spiked to $130 per barrel by March 15th, but then something happened that Tehran fundamentally miscalculated. The United States did not negotiate. It deployed. And it did not just deploy to keep Hormuz open for global traffic. It deployed to close Hormuz specifically for Iran. On April 13th, 2026, U.S. Central Command announced what it called a comprehensive maritime security operation in the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, and adjacent waterways. The diplomatic language was careful. The operational reality was blunt. According to reporting from CNBC, Al Jazeera, and Jane's Defense Weekly, U.S. naval assets began systematically identifying, tracking, and intercepting every vessel with suspected links to Iranian crude oil exports. Not through digital sanctions lists, through physical boarding operations. The first confirmed interdiction occurred on April 15th. The Zanzibar-flagged tanker MT Jasmine, believed to be carrying 1 million barrels of Iranian crude toward buyers in Southeast Asia, was stopped 85 nautical miles east of Fujairah. Marines from the USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group fast-roped onto the deck. The ship's AIS transponder, the automatic identification system that functions like a ship's digital license plate, had been disabled for 11 days. That did not matter. U.S. surveillance had tracked the vessel via synthetic aperture radar from orbit and hull signature analysis. The ship was boarded, inspected, and the cargo was confirmed as Iranian crude loaded from Karg Island on April 9th. The ship was not seized. It was turned around and escorted back toward Iranian waters with a message that was operational, not diplomatic. This route is closed. By April 21st, according to data compiled by tankertrackers.com and corroborated by Bloomberg shipping analysts, at least 14 additional vessels had been interdicted under similar circumstances. Some were released after inspections showed no Iranian linkage. Others were redirected. But the effect on Iran's export infrastructure was immediate and cascading. Let us talk about what happens when an oil exporting nation cannot export oil, because the mathematics are unforgiving. Iran produces approximately 3.1 million barrels of crude oil per day, according to the International Energy Agency's March 2026 report. Before the blockade, roughly 2.1 million of those barrels were exported. The remainder was consumed domestically or refined into products. With exports cut by 73%, Iran now has an additional 1.5 million barrels per day that have nowhere to go except into storage. Between April 13th and April 26th, that is 13 days, Iran would have accumulated approximately 19.5 million barrels of unsold crude. According to analysis from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, Iran's total onshore storage capacity at Karg Island, which handles 90% of the country's crude exports, plus mainland tank farms, is estimated at roughly 70 to 85 million barrels. Satellite imagery analyzed by Maxar Technologies and reported by Reuters shows storage tank floating roof levels at Karg Island had reached 74% capacity by April 20th. If you run the numbers forward, and this is critical, Iran has between 12 and 22 days of remaining storage before the system reaches physical capacity. After that, one of two things must happen. Either production gets shut in, meaning wells stop pumping, or oil starts getting stored in ways it was never designed to be stored, tank overflows, emergency containment, or even flaring of associated natural gas because there is nowhere to put the liquids. Now, here is the technical dimension that most coverage is ignoring entirely, and it matters enormously for the long-term strategic picture. Oil wells, particularly mature fields operating under natural pressure depletion, like many of Iran's aging reserves, do not restart like a light switch. When you shut in a well, especially one that has been producing for decades, you risk permanent damage to the reservoir. Pressure differentials change. Water encroachment can occur. Formation damage can happen at the well bore. According to petroleum engineering studies cited by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, some wells lose between 10% and 30% of their production capacity permanently after being shut in for extended periods. This is the silent dimension of the blockade. The damage that does not make headlines because it happens underground invisibly, but does not reverse. Iran is not just losing revenue today. It is potentially losing productive capacity for years. However, and this is where responsible analysis requires us to pump the brakes, not every expert believes Iran is on the edge of immediate systemic collapse. Kenneth Katzman, formerly a senior Middle East analyst at the Congressional Research Service, told Al Jazeera on April 24th that Iran has been preparing for exactly this scenario for years. According to his assessment, Iran currently has between 160 million and 170 million barrels of crude oil stored on tankers floating in international waters, oil that left Iran before the blockade was imposed and is waiting for buyers or for conditions to change. At current loss rates of roughly 1.5 million barrels per day of unsold production, that floating reserve could theoretically sustain Iran's revenue flows until mid-August, giving Tehran nearly 4 months of strategic runway. Analysts at Rapidan Energy Group, an independent oil market research firm, noted in an April 22nd briefing that Iran studied what happened to Venezuela when that country faced similar export paralysis under U.S. sanctions. Venezuela's oil sector never recovered. Iran, they argue, built redundancy into its system precisely to avoid that fate. So what we are watching is not a knockout punch. It is a war of attrition. The question is, which pressure breaks first? Iran's storage and revenue capacity, or U.S. political will to sustain a naval blockade that requires significant ongoing operational costs and risks escalation every single day it continues. But while analysts have been debating timelines and storage math, something happened 6 days ago that fundamentally alters the strategic chessboard, and Iran has no obvious countermove. On April 28, 2026, the United Arab Emirates announced it would immediately withdraw from OPEC and the OPEC Plus framework. After 58 years of membership, the UAE is out. The official statement from UAE Energy Minister Suhail al-Mazrouei cited long-term strategic and economic considerations. That is diplomatic language doing a lot of work. Let us say what the clean language will not. The UAE just looked at the future of Gulf energy exports and decided that its interests are better served outside the collective than inside it. And the reason has everything to do with a 380-kilometer pipeline that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz entirely. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, sometimes called the AD-COP, runs from the Habshan oil fields in Abu Dhabi's interior directly to the export terminal at Fujairah, which sits on the Gulf of Oman outside the Strait of Hormuz. Current capacity, approximately 2 million barrels per day, according to Pipeline Technology Journal. In 2025, the UAE exported roughly 1.7 million barrels per day through that route. During this crisis, while Iranian oil has been bottlenecked and global supplies constrained, that pipeline has been the UAE's economic lifeline. Think about what that means strategically. Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz only works if closing the strait inflicts symmetric pain. If everyone suffers equally, pressure mounts for de-escalation. But the UAE is demonstrating in real time that a Hormuz bypass is not just possible, it is operationally viable at scale right now. And here's the piece that changes everything for Iran's long-term position. Under OPEC quota agreements, the UAE was restricted to producing roughly 3.2 million barrels per day. But the UAE has invested more than $150 billion, according to Reuters and Bloomberg Energy reporting, in expanding production capacity toward 5 million barrels per day by 2027. They built the infrastructure. OPEC told them not to use it. Outside OPEC, that restriction disappears. The UAE can now produce to the limits of its physical infrastructure. And that oil can exit through Fujairah, bypassing both the Strait of Hormuz and any Iranian leverage over it. For Tehran, this is a two-dimensional catastrophe. Dimension 1, export volume crushed by the U.S. blockade today. Dimension 2, long-term price environment threatened by increased Gulf supply from a competitor who no longer needs Iranian permission to access markets. Iran's position is eroding on both timelines simultaneously. Now let us talk about what this means for the rest of the world. Because geopolitics in the Gulf does not stay in the Gulf. It travels and it arrives at your gas station, your grocery store, and your mortgage payment. As of April 29th, Brent crude is trading at approximately $107 per barrel. For context, on February 27th, before this crisis began, Brent was trading around $82. That is a 43% increase in under 2 months. According to the American Automobile Association, average gasoline prices in the United States have climbed to $4.12 per gallon as of late April, up from $3.18 in late February. That is a 30% increase. But energy price shocks do not stay contained in the energy sector. They propagate. Every truck that moves goods runs on diesel. Every factory consumes electricity often generated from natural gas or oil. Every container ship crossing an ocean burns bunker fuel priced off the same global crude benchmarks. When energy costs spike 30% to 40%, that cost works its way into every supply chain, every price tag, every budget. Economists call this imported inflation, price pressure that originates externally but manifests domestically. Then there is the dimension almost no one is covering. According to analysis cited in economic impact studies of the Hormuz crisis, approximately 30% of globally traded fertilizers transit the Strait of Hormuz under normal conditions. We are talking about urea, phosphates, ammonia, the chemical building blocks of industrial agriculture. When fertilizer supply chains get disrupted, the impact does not appear instantly. It appears 90 to 120 days later when the next planting cycle begins with reduced inputs, leading to lower crop yields, tighter food supply, and higher prices at the supermarket. The naval blockade you are reading about in April will express itself as food price inflation in July and August. There is also the aviation sector. Airlines operating long-haul routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa have been forced to reroute around Middle Eastern airspace entirely, adding between 45 minutes and 2 hours to flight times and thousands of dollars in additional fuel costs per flight. Those costs are already appearing in ticket prices. If you are booking international travel for late 2026, you are buying into a market where operational costs have structurally increased. And then there is the interest rate trap. Central banks and import-dependent economies are now facing a brutal contradiction. Slowing economic growth would normally argue for cutting interest rates to stimulate activity. But energy-driven inflation argues for keeping rates high or even raising them to prevent runaway price increases. For anyone carrying a variable rate mortgage, a car loan, or business debt, that contradiction is not academic. It is a real monthly payment decision. However, here is the crucial counterpoint. The severity and duration of these economic effects hinge entirely on how quickly this crisis resolves. Markets are forward-looking. A credible negotiation framework, even without an immediate resolution, could release price pressure rapidly. Analysts at Rapidan Energy and other independent research firms have noted that if Hormuz reopens to normal traffic and Iranian exports resume even partially, oil prices could fall $20 to $30 per barrel within weeks. The damage is real, but it is not necessarily permanent. The question is whether the diplomatic off-ramp exists. So let us sit with the uncertainty, because honesty demands it. Here is what we do not know. We do not know whether Iran's floating oil reserves, that 160 to 170 million barrels sitting on tankers in international waters, will be enough to extend Tehran's economic runway into August, as some analysts suggest, or whether domestic pressures will force a decision much sooner. We do not know whether the U.S. Navy can sustain this operational tempo indefinitely. Blockades are manpower-intensive, expensive, and politically risky. One miscalculation, one incident involving casualties and domestic political pressure in Washington could shift overnight. We do not know whether the UAE's exit from OPEC is the first domino or an isolated move. If Saudi Arabia or Iraq follows, OPEC as a price-setting mechanism effectively ends. If they do not, the UAE may find itself isolated in ways it did not anticipate. And we do not know how far Iran is willing to go. A nation facing economic collapse has historically been a nation willing to take risks that appear irrational from the outside. What we do know is that 3 scenarios are on the table right now. Scenario 1, a negotiated agreement. The U.S. offers sanctions relief and a lifting of the blockade in exchange for verifiable limits on Iran's nuclear program and regional activities. This is the diplomatic path. It has been tried before. It could work again if both sides see it as preferable to the alternatives. Scenario 2, prolonged attrition. The blockade continues. Iran's economy contracts further. Domestic unrest grows. Tehran either capitulates under pressure or finds ways to survive on a significantly reduced revenue base, much like North Korea has under sanctions for decades. Scenario 3, escalation. Iran conducts a retaliatory strike, either on U.S. naval assets, regional partners, or energy infrastructure in neighboring countries. The U.S. responds militarily. The conflict expands. None of those scenarios returns the region to February 27, 2026. That world is gone. The energy architecture of the Persian Gulf is being rewritten right now. The UAE has made its move. The U.S. has deployed a naval blockade at a scale not seen in half a century. Iran's storage tanks are filling by the hour, and the rest of the world is watching oil prices, food costs, and interest rates move in directions that affect every household budget on the planet. The next move has not been made yet. But when it is, the consequences will not be contained to the Gulf. They will ripple through global markets, diplomatic relationships, and strategic calculations for years. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz and why it matters to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is far from over and the next chapter could be written in the next 72 hours.